Das Leben kann ein Abenteuer sein. Spannend, schnell,
langsam oder traurig.
manchmal sogar mit Höhen und Tiefen.
Aber gemäß Psychiatern kann jeder Aspekt des Lebens als psychische Erkrankung bezeichnet werden.
Wirklich? Was zum Beispiel?
Wenn Sie nach einer gescheiterten Beziehung verstimmt sind, könnte man das als Depression bezeichnen.
Und wenn man nervös ist, bevor man vor Leuten spricht?
Angststörung.
Oder wenn man sehr gesprächig und aktiv ist?
Manisch.
Das klingt ziemlich verrückt.
Allerdings.
Aber in welchem Ausmaß findet das wirklich statt?
Fragen wir mal.
How many people do you know that have been diagnosed with a mental disorder?
Diagnosed with a mental, God, off the top of my head, maybe one person that I know who's been diagnosed with a mental disorder.
Probably just one.
So, yeah, maybe 2 or 3 people, maybe in the 3 or 4 range.
4 or 5, maybe 5.
6 people in the household.
6, 7.
10.
A dozen or so.
About 20.
How about 30?
Would definitely be in the hundreds for sure.
The total number of people that I know in my lifetime has been diagnosed with a mental disorder probably fall around the range of 100 to 150, and I'm 23 years old.
Wow, aber woher kommen alle diese Störungen?
Aus dem Diagnostischen und Statistischen Manual psychischer Störungen der Psychiatrie. Das ist 943 Seiten dick und umfasst alles von Depression und Angst bis zu Stottern, Zigarettenabhängigkeit, Angst vor Spinnen, Albträumen, Schwierigkeiten mit Mathematik und sogar Störungen der frühen Kindheit. Uninterpretiert und viele davon fälschlich als Gehirnerkrankungen bezeichnet.
Aber manche Leute haben doch ernsthafte Probleme im Leben.
Sicher, aber Psychiater führen diese Schwierigkeiten darauf zurück, dass etwas mit ihrem Gehirn verkehrt ist.
Psychiater haben also ein Buch, das normale Probleme des Lebens als geistige Störungen uminterpretiert?
Genau,
Das muss wohl wissenschaftlich gestützt sein.
überhaupt nicht. Bei einer kürzlichen Tagung gaben Psychiater das auch zu. Hören Sie sich das an.
DSM is made up by committees of men who have political opinion, and women too, who have biases and political opinions. And so there isn't nearly as much science in DSM as there ought to be.
Like in the previous one, people had a meeting in the bathroom and they decided that something should be in there, and then they would go and propose it to the whole committee.
You have this kind of lumping together of several observations, and when you get enough of them in one tent, you got a diagnosis.
DSM system is not the real system of the diagnosis.
A lot of the disorders that are in there haven't necessarily been rigorously validated.
It's just the best tool that we have available, but it is not perfect.
It's so useless that if you give me a patient and the DSM, I'll make at least 20 diagnoses on the same patient.
You have to take it with a grain of salt anyway.
It's actually getting more and more complicated.
We're left with diagnosing things on the basis of checklists and questionnaires, which leaves us sort of out of, as you said, the rest of medicine because we don't have a biological test.
Erstaunlich.
Der Mangel an Wissenschaftlichkeit im DSM ist ein offenes Geheimnis. Hier ist, was einige Fachleute darüber zu sagen haben.
The DSM is a sham. It's been described as a house of cards. Why? Because the diagnoses are theoretical. They're not based on scientific measurements.
It's sort of a shaky level built on another shaky level, built on another shaky level.
It is flimsy and that it is easily collapsible under the scrutiny of critical thinking.
If you just pull one little fragment of the reasoning aside and question it thoroughly, you'll find it doesn't stand up, and then that means that the whole organism collapses because you've got some wrong premises in there somewhere. In fact, they're all over the place.
It is indeed a house of cards because it's predicated on not a solid structure. It is built to create an apparently legitimate edifice, which results in a diagnosis. But any serious inquiry will show it to be illegitimate.
Here, I tell you. With schizophrenia?
Wenn das DSM nicht auf wissenschaftlicher Erkenntnis beruht, worauf beruht es dann?
Es begann mit dem Wunsch der Psychiatrie und der Psychologie, von der etablierten Medizin akzeptiert zu werden.
We psychologists have always desperately wanted to be accepted as a real science, as a true science. Now, what the early psychologists did was they looked around and they saw what other scientists were doing and they decided to emulate them.
Modern approaches to classifying psychiatric disorders dates from the 19th century.
Nearly all the clinical concepts we have today originate from that time. Probably the most important of all was a chap called Emil Kraepelin, who worked first of all in Heidelberg and then in Munich.
Nie von ihm gehört.
Emil Kraepelin gilt als Begründer der Klassifizierung psychischer Störungen. Er klassifizierte als erster, was er für biologische Erkrankungen des Gehirns hielt. Daher rührt das Konzept der Dementia praecox, heute Schizophrenie genannt, das manisch-depressive Irresein und paranoide Psychose. Die Konzepte existieren noch heute im DSM.
Das ist alles? 3 Störungen?
Ja, nur 3. Aber Kraepelins System wurde schnell sehr beliebt. Hören Sie sich das mal an.
Kraepelin's system caught on very quickly, not only in the German-speaking world, but also in the English-speaking world, in the United States and Britain. It caught on because up to that point, nobody had an agreed way of talking about patients.
So in the early 1950s, there was compiled Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. Now, there are very few statistics in the book. Disorder is used essentially as a euphemism for illness. This is a book which catalogues mental illnesses for which no medical sign has ever been discovered.
Diese primitive Broschüre umfasste 130 Seiten mit 112 psychischen Störungen. Ein kleines Heft im Vergleich zum gegenwärtigen DSM, viel größer als was Kraepelin sich vorgestellt hatte.
Warum so viele?
Indem sie immer mehr Aspekte des Lebens als abnormal definierten, konnten sich Psychiater riesige öffentliche Gelder sichern.
Das Leben definieren? Was meinen Sie damit?
Na, zum Beispiel die Luft anhalten, an den Fingernägeln kauen, am Daumen lutschen, Schlafwandeln, ineffizient sein, sogar Homosexualität.
Das ist lächerlich. Sie haben all das hinzugefügt, nur um Leute behandeln zu können?
Und noch mehr. Im Jahr 1968 kam das DSM-2 heraus mit sogar 178 Störungen. So konnte man auf noch mehr Versicherungsgelder zugreifen. Um dies auf internationale Ebene auszuweiten, wurde das DSM-2 an das Buch der Internationalen Klassifikation der Krankheiten, ICD, angepasst. Die ICD wird in aller Welt ausgiebig verwendet und enthält neben psychiatrischen Diagnosen auch wirkliche medizinische Krankheiten.
So wurden psychische Störungen von der etablierten Medizin akzeptiert.
Das war ein Anfang, aber das DSM-2 war immer noch nicht wissenschaftlich fundiert, da es nicht von klinischen Tests, sondern den Theorien des Psychologen Sigmund Freud beeinflusst war.
Dann standen da wohl viele Neurosen in dem Buch, oder?
Allerdings. Aber es enthielt kein Wissen über die Ursachen. Sie versuchten nicht einmal eine Ursache zu finden.
Inclusion of a disorder in the classification does not require that there be knowledge about its etiology. So in other words, to make a diagnosis, you really don't need to bother with cause and effect. You don't need to know what causes the condition.
Moment mal, wenn im DSM nicht steht, was die psychischen Störungen verursacht, wie entdecken Psychiater sie dann?
Die Antwort könnte Sie überraschen.
New diseases are being invented all the time, and I want to emphasize the word invented, because when it comes to psychiatry, mental illnesses are not discovered. They're invented.
The way the system works in terms of diagnosis is that every few years a group of psychiatrists and psychologists sit around in a room and vote on new diagnoses.
Das ist Wissenschaft? Ich kann es nicht glauben.
Keine Angst, da sind Sie nicht der Einzige.
The diseases are voted on? What do you mean?
Did you say, are they voted into existence?
Are voted?
As in created.
Oh, man.
I think that's kind of ridiculous.
It's crazy that you would vote. I definitely don't agree.
I don't agree with it at all.
Mental disorders should be based on scientific research.
I have been led to believe that it's all based on medicine and science.
So I'm kind of shocked to find that out.
Ich auch.
Es gibt mehr. Psychische Störungen kommen nicht nur durch Abstimmung in das DSM, manchmal werden sie auch per Abstimmung wieder entfernt. Zum Beispiel Homosexualität, die im DSM 1 und 2 als Geisteskrankheit aufgeführt ist. Der Chefredakteur des DSM 3, Robert Spitzer, erklärte das folgendermaßen.
I came up with a definition in 1973 that made it possible to argue that homosexuality was not a mental disorder.
On a vote, essentially, at a conference of the American Psychiatric Association, it was removed.
Now, did they discover that homosexuality was not a disease through scientific processes? No. It was included for political reasons, and it was removed for political reasons.
And the end result is a vote. It's a supposed democracy. So to call it science is a complete fabrication.
Das DSM ist also ein politisches Werk und kein wissenschaftliches.
Genau.
Ich dachte, Psychiater wollten als Ärzte angesehen werden.
Das stimmt. Deshalb musste ihr Diagnosehandbuch viel wissenschaftlicher aussehen.
Was ist nicht wahr? Was taten Sie also?
Nun, sie entschieden, dass die nächste Ausgabe des DSM ganz anders sein würde. Und diese Entscheidung sollte die Psychiatrie für immer verändern.
If you roll the clock forward to the 1970s in the United States, basically at that time psychiatry was in very poor shape for a number of reasons. First of all, it was held in very low regard by other members of the medical profession. So psychiatry was the sort of thing you did if you couldn't succeed in any other area of medicine.
And people such as Robert Spitzer in America made it very clear that the time had come essentially for psychiatrists, being doctors of medicine, to practice medicine. So if a psychiatrist was spending a lot of time dealing with people who were anxious, depressed, these dilemmas, these problems in living now essentially had to be redefined. And they were redefined as medical conditions.
And their solution to this was to come up with a manual which defined psychiatric disorders more carefully. So hence we have DSM-3, which is the third edition, which is published in 1980.
Die Psychiater unter Spitzer, die das DSM-3 redigierten, verwarfen Freudsche Psychologie und verfügten, dass die psychiatrischen Diagnosen von nun an rein biologischer Natur waren.
Gingen Sie die Sache also endlich wissenschaftlich an?
Nein, überhaupt nicht. Die politischen Streitereien darüber, welche Störungen in das DSM-3 aufgenommen werden sollten und welche nicht, waren sogar noch lächerlicher. Ein Psychiater sagte Folgendes darüber.
They would squeeze into a room which was about half the size of this one. It was much too small. And Bob would raise a provocative question, and people would shout out their opinions from all sides of the room. And whoever shouted loudest tended to be heard. My own impression is it was more like a tobacco auction than a sort of conference.
Ein anderes Mitglied des DSM-Entscheidungsgremiums sagte:
The low level of intellectual effort was shocking. Diagnoses were developed by majority vote on the level we would use to choose a restaurant. You feel like Italian, I feel like Chinese, so let's go to a cafeteria. Then it's typed into the computer. It may reflect on our naivete, but it was our belief that there would be an attempt to look at things scientifically.
Scheint so, als hätten Sie ein Diagnosehandbuch, das zwar so aussah, aber nicht mehr Wissenschaftlichkeit enthielt als zuvor.
Inzwischen schnellte die Anzahl der Störungen im DSM-3 auf 259 hinauf. Um die Idee zu verkaufen, dass es sich bei der Psychiatrie um eine echte medizinische Wissenschaft handle, mussten sie diese mit einer wissenschaftlich erscheinenden Theorie versehen.
But with DSM-3 from 1980 on, there was the progressive medicalisation of psychiatry. And the notion of chemical imbalance was invented and essentially took hold.
Wow, chemisches was?
Die Theorie des chemischen Ungleichgewichts. Sie kam zuerst 1965 auf bei der Klärung, ob ein Ungleichgewicht gewisser Stoffe im Hirn Depression herbeiführen könnte.
Ich würde gern mehr darüber hören.
Josef Schildkraut stellte die Theorie auf, da Psychopharmaka die Gehirnchemie verändern, dass Geisteskrankheit durch einen Mangel oder Überschuss von Stoffen im Hirn ausgelöst werden müssten.
Ist es nicht verkehrt herum?
Klar, als würde man sagen, da Aspirin gegen Kopfschmerzen hilft, dass Kopfschmerzen durch einen Mangel an Aspirin ausgelöst werden.
Ich verstehe.
Aber es war überzeugend genug, um der Psychiatrie und dem DSM-3 vordergründige Wissenschaftlichkeit zu verleihen. Robert Spitzer drückt es so aus.
Psychiatry felt now, gee, we're more scientific, we're part of medicine.
Es hat also funktioniert.
Ja, und seither haben Psychiater und die Pharmaindustrie unermüdlich für diese Theorie des chemischen Ungleichgewichts geworben, sowohl bei der Ärzteschaft als auch bei der Öffentlichkeit.
If you're one of the millions of people who live with uncontrollable worry, anxiety, and several of these symptoms for 6 months or more, you could be suffering from generalized anxiety disorder, and a chemical imbalance could be to blame.
Pristique is thought to work by affecting the levels of 2 chemicals in the brain.
It works to correct chemical imbalances in the brain, which may be related to symptoms of social anxiety disorder.
Cymbalta works on serotonin and norepinephrine.
Hundreds of thousands of patients have been prescribed Abilify. Ask your doctor.
Ask your doctor.
Talk to your doctor. Call your doctor.
Ask your doctor about Cymbalta.
Prestique is a key in helping to treat my depression. Ask your doctor about Prestique.
You come to my office, and I say to you, well, you describe what's going on in your life and your symptoms, and I say, well, it's clear to me that you've got a chemical imbalance, and we're going to write you a prescription for this. The truth of the matter is, there's no such thing as a chemical imbalance.
There's no test out there that they can depend on that tells you you have a chemical imbalance.
There's actually, in fact, dozens of studies showing that there isn't any measurable imbalance. So psychiatrists will explain to patients all the time, this is just like diabetes. In diabetes, you have low insulin, we have to readjust the insulin level. In depression, you have low serotonin, we have to readjust the serotonin level. But actually, we have already proven that there's nothing wrong with serotonin levels. It's completely a myth, disproven by our own evidence.
I had a psychiatrist. He said that, in his professional opinion, this child had ADHD, a chemical imbalance of the brain. And when he was questioned on the witness stand as an expert witness for the state, he was asked if they had done an MRI. He said no. He was questioned if they had done a CAT scan. He said no. He was asked if they had done any bodily fluid check known to medical science to prove that this child had a chemical imbalance of the brain. He says no. And when he was asked how he arrived at this ADHD diagnosis, a chemical imbalance of the brain, it came down to that he had counseled and observed this child for 2 hours, and half of the time was observing. How do you arrive at a diagnosis of a chemical imbalance of the brain by talking to a child and observing them for 2 hours? You don't, okay? It's pure guesswork.
Wow, im Ernst?
Sehen Sie selbst. Folgendes ist passiert, als jemand mit einer versteckten Kamera verschiedene Psychiater besuchte und darum bat, auf eine psychische Krankheit untersucht zu werden.
Of any scientific test?
Not that I'm prepared to do this time. No,
So you getting that I have adjustment, what is it again?
Adjustment disorder is mixed emotional thinking. It just means situational stress.
Right,
It's a formal diagnosis.
But I'm saying, just where do you get that from?
I take you at face value.
In terms of diagnosis, there's no way that I can x-ray or project or allow.
So it's very hard to have anything to measure, because whatever's going wrong, it's happening in there, and we just can't go in and open up, somebody's skull and scoop something out to measure.
Right now, we don't have an X-ray or a blood test. That doesn't mean that the diagnosis is not real.
The diagnosis is for insurance, and I'm not really trying to think too much in terms of diagnosis. I don't really see that as my main job here, to make a diagnosis, except give something to the insurance that's reasonably accurate.
But we don't even really know what's going wrong in the brain. So all the things that we found were found by accident.
Das haut mich um. Psychiatrische Diagnosen beruhen vollständig auf persönlicher Meinung.
Ganz gleich, was Sie tun, Sie haben Unrecht. Die BBC hat sogar eine Sendung darüber gebracht. Dabei wurden 10 Freiwillige, von denen 5 als normal galten und 5 vormals als psychisch krank diagnostiziert wurden, von 3 namhaften psychiatrischen Fachleuten beobachtet. Dann wurden sie gefragt, ob sie unterscheiden könnten.
Oh weia.
Schauen Sie sich das mal an.
We think that it's likely that you've had a history of bipolar disorder. Is that correct?
You're wrong.
Okay.
We've come to the conclusion that at some time you've been diagnosed with a mood disorder.
You're wrong.
We were wondering whether at some point in your life maybe that you had suffered from a significant psychiatric problem of some kind or other.
No.
Not at all?
You are wrong.
All right, okay.
3 wrong diagnoses in a row. After a whole week of observation, the panel have identified just 2 out of 5 disorders.
So viel zur Wissenschaftlichkeit.
Ganz genau.
Okay, I'm in. And I got a pair
of compulsive disorders here.
Eine Frage. Wie können Psychiater behaupten, sie seien beweisorientiert, wenn sie keine Beweise haben?
Das ist nicht alles. Psychiater haben nicht nur keine Tests, um die psychische Störung nachzuweisen, die sie bei Patienten angeblich feststellen. Sie können sie nicht einmal definieren.
Nein.
Sie geben das sogar im DSM zu. Schauen Sie mal.
Although this manual provides a classification of mental disorders, it must be admitted that no definition adequately specifies precise boundaries for the concept of mental disorder. There you go.
Unglaublich.
Aber die Psychiater waren noch nicht fertig. 14 Jahre nach DSM 3 veröffentlichten sie DSM 4. Der Chefredakteur äußerte sich noch unverblümter über den Begriff psychische Störung.
There is no definition of a mental disorder. It's bullshit. I mean, you just can't define it.
Obwohl sie zugaben, dass sie eine psychische Störung nicht definieren konnten, ein Begriff im Titel ihres eigenen Handbuchs, fügten sie weitere Störungen hinzu?
Viele weitere, um genau zu sein 115 weitere, was die Gesamtzahl auf 374 bringt.
Im Vergleich zum DSM-1 sind es über 3-mal so viele Störungen.
Und das in nur 40 Jahren. Und das Buch wiegt fast 5 Pfund.
Das ist dicker als ein Telefonbuch.
Es ist ein Katalog für Geisteskrankheiten. Und damit wurde bei 120 Millionen Menschen aus aller Welt eine Geisteskrankheit diagnostiziert.
Wow. Und die internationale Klassifikation der Krankheiten? Gab es da auch eine Zunahme der psychischen Störungen?
Absolut. Das Kapitel über psychische und Verhaltensstörungen in der ICD entspricht beinahe dem DSM. Was im DSM aufgegriffen wird, spiegelt sich auch dort wider.
Okay, es gibt also keinen Test, mit dem eine psychische Störung identifiziert werden kann. Es gibt keinen Beweis für die Theorie des chemischen Ungleichgewichts. Und die wissen nicht einmal, was eine psychische Störung ist.
Und sie geben das zu, wenigstens untereinander. Folgendes sagt ein renommierter Psychiater auf einer kürzlichen APA-Tagung.
You're sitting in your office, you see a depressed patient, you have no idea what's the matter with them. And I know all of you think you know the answer, but in terms of evidence, I don't know the answer and I don't think any of us really know.
Das ist erstaunlich.
Trotzdem werden sie schnell mit einer Diagnose bei der Hand sein. Dies ist ein weiterer einflussreicher Psychiater bei derselben Konferenz.
Jim Burley at the Maudsley Hospital did a study once on how long it took people to make up their mind about the diagnosis after they entered a room. And it was about, how many, David? It was 2 seconds? It was a couple of minutes. It was very...
Ein paar Minuten?
Ja, sogar der designierte Präsident der American Psychiatric Association hat gesagt, dass das DSM ein ziemlicher Witz ist.
Well, what does D stand for? I used to think it is diagnostic, but over the last few years realized it is more like a dartboard.
Dartscheibe? Erzählen die Psychiater ihren Patienten davon?
Nein, die Psychiater tun so, als wüssten sie, worüber sie sprechen, während sie die Öffentlichkeit im Dunkeln lassen.
I was sent to a psychiatrist who saw me again for maybe about 15 minutes, talked to me how I was doing at 7 years old, and I left with a prescription for Ritalin.
Probably within the first 15 minutes, he diagnosed me with having an anxiety disorder and put me on prescription medication.
The amount of time it took for the diagnosis was, I'd say, probably within 10 minutes I was diagnosed with anxiety, with depression, within 10 minutes of speaking to the psychiatrist, and I was put on those drugs immediately.
I received numerous different diagnoses from different doctors, and each one gave me a different drug.
I didn't have to undergo any tests. I didn't even have to sit there, and I didn't have to ask any questions. It was just, that's what you've got, and this is the drug.
They really didn't talk to me. They were always talking and questioning my mother. It was all about getting the information from her and not from me.
It doesn't make sense to me. I researched it, I've done my research, and I still can't fully understand how you can diagnose somebody with a short attention span.
There was never an explanation. Nobody really knew what it was or why it was caused or how did you get it? Why did anybody have it? And what could anybody do about it? Just here, have some medicine and go away.
And I was put on, a horse's dose of an antidepressant called Effexor, 450 milligrams a day. They say if you're on 300, you're comatose.
It wasn't always Ritalin. It went from Ritalin to Wellbutrin to Concerta
to Adderall. I remember asking these doctors, is there any other way we can do this? Is there any other therapy? Is there something we can do that won't make me feel so badly, that won't give me all these side effects and just horrible sensations through my body 24 hours a day? Is there something else I can do that might be not having to do with medications? Doctor said, no. See, what you have is very complex. You have a chemical imbalance in your brain that the only thing that can correct it is medication.
Wow. Viele Diagnosen, aber man bekommt nur Psychopharmaka.
Genau. Eine psychiatrische Diagnose bedeutet heutzutage ein Psychopharmakon.
The whole question then becomes, okay, if we apply these labels, what next? And the what next tends to be, you get a prescription. And the prescription is for a drug that doesn't work very well and is toxic.
It's like a 1-2 punch. The number one of the 1-2 punch is the diagnostic manual. You've got all these disorders to choose from. The two is the treatment. So you've got the diagnostic manual in place, you've got a machinery in place, and then you've got this treatment that is there for the taking.
For everything you can think of that might seem to be odd behavior, the psychiatry field has a name for it. And then for every name of every diagnosis you have, there's going to be pharmacology behind it, and they have a pill for it.
Let me fan it out and pick a card, and there you go. Here's your label, and there's the drug that we'll give you to go along with that label.
98%, maybe 99% of people will get a diagnosis that justifies the use of a medication and also a follow-up appointment. Because remember, the business of medicine, the business of psychiatry, is seeing patients. And the psychiatrist that tells a patient they don't have a problem and there's no medicine for that problem doesn't have a very busy practice.
And that's sort of the purpose of the DSM-345, to provide a diagnosis that can be given a drug for that patient.
It's a quick buck. You don't need to do a physical exam. You put it in the chart, it's done. Prescribe away. Lifetime patient. That's what the DSM is for.
Das DSM soll also nur eine Behandlung mit Psychopharmaka rechtfertigen?
Ich fürchte ja.
Wow. Wenn psychiatrische Behandlung vor allem Verabreichen von Psychopharmaka bedeutet, werden bestimmt viele Mittel verschrieben.
So ist es. Wussten Sie, dass pro Jahr über 600 Millionen Rezepte für Psychopharmaka ausgestellt werden?
Puh, aber was macht man mit Patienten, die keine nehmen wollen?
Sogar dafür hat das DSM eine Kategorie.
It says V15.81, non-compliance with treatment. Now this category can be used when the focus of clinical attention is non-compliance with an important aspect of treatment for a mental disorder or a general medical condition. If you refuse treatment, then you probably are mentally ill, ipso facto, by that fact alone.
Wenn man also nicht das tut, was ein Psychiater verlangt, wird einem eine psychische Störung angehängt?
Genau.
Das ist beängstigend. Warum würde man der Behandlung nicht Folge leisten?
Weil die Psychopharmaka, die Psychiater verschreiben, sehr schwerwiegende körperliche Reaktionen auslösen können.
Sie meinen Nebenwirkungen?
Nein, nicht ganz.
Drugs really don't have side effects. Drugs only have effects, and we arbitrarily differentiate those effects of the drug that we like, and we say these are the effects of the drug. And those that we don't like, those are the side effects. It's akin to saying that a bomb that comes down on a building kills people and destroys the building, and the military general says, oh, killing of the people is really a side effect. No, you cannot separate out the destroying of the building and the killing of the people. And so these are not side effects, these are direct effects of the drug creating disaster.
People think antidepressants are going to make them happy, but it's not what they do. They numb them down, and then in themselves there's a withdrawal state from the antidepressants.
They just become like robots, some of them. They're not actually able to experience the whole variety and range of human feelings and emotions and work with them and express with them and share them with others. Because once you sort of put somebody on a heavy dose psychotic drug, I mean, you're just dehumanizing them.
These are very potent, very toxic medicines, cause on themselves diabetes, high cholesterol, cause what's called a metabolic syndrome, truncal obesity, premature hardening of the arteries.
They affect the heart and the lungs and the kidneys, and you never know exactly what to expect.
Most psychotropic drugs lead to massive weight gain. Some of them, like olanzapine, for example, can lead to weight gains of 25, 30, even 40 kilos in a year or two, and that is serious.
One of the side effects is it affects your sexual performance abilities.
In people who are on a lot of medication, they're just totally unable to detoxify through their liver, and then other functions of the body shut down one by one.
These drugs have on their labels may increase the risk of suicide and homicide in people who take them, just like a carton of cigarettes tests to say may be hazardous to your health.
And there's cases where many people who commit suicide or commit acts of violence are on these medications, which definitely has this type of side effect.
You look at the side effect profile is identical to what they're trying to treat, and in some cases worse, and especially in the instance of suicide, then you could see that it's an extremely treacherous area with very, very little actual science behind it.
Machen Sie Witze? Das sind gefährliche Mittel.
Ja, und es gab Tausende, vielleicht sogar Millionen von Opfern, die sich hilfesuchend an die Psychiatrie wandten, denen dann Psychodrogen verabreicht wurden, die sie zerstörten. Menschen wie Candace, die Zoloft nahm, weil sie vor Prüfungen nervös war. Steven, der Selbstmord beging nach 19 Tagen auf Prozac. Julie, die zum College gehen wollte, erhängte sich nach nur 7 Tagen auf Zoloft. Matthew, der sich mit 13 aufhängte. Matt, ein 21-Jähriger auf einem Psychopharmaka-Cocktail. Caitlin, die Zoloft und Trazodon einnahm. Beth, die wegen Schlafstörung auf Paxil gesetzt wurde. Matthew, nachdem er mit Lixapro angefangen hatte. Charles, der Clozaril nahm. Caitlin, eine 12-Jährige. Megan, Aaron.
Halt, warten Sie. Das ist verrückt. All diese Selbstmordopfer nahmen Psychopharmaka ein?
Ja, pro Jahr werden in den USA ungefähr 42.000 Todesfälle mit Psychopharmaka in Verbindung gebracht.
Wow, das sind über 3.000 Leute pro Monat. Diese Mittel sollten vom Markt genommen werden.
Auf jeden Fall. Aber weil diese Mittel die hauptsächliche Behandlungsmethode der Psychiater darstellen, spielen sie die Risiken herunter. Und die Patienten zahlen den Preis dafür.
When you get on the psychiatric drugs, you feel just like you don't really want to live anymore. Like, just depressed all the time, and you feel sad.
You don't feel like you're in your own skin. It almost feels like you just want to come out of your skin all the time.
Get really bad headaches, I'd start shaking. I wouldn't sleep very well, I'd have nightmares.
I had started shaking really bad, and it was like uncontrollable, you know? And it's like, I don't understand why I shake so much.
It brought on the symptoms that I was trying to escape from, very severe.
I'd go through spells where I'd just be completely just dead. There would not be me there. I'd just be standing there and there would be nothing.
I think we all have emotions, happy, sad, you know, situational emotions in life, and it didn't allow me to experience them.
You don't experience tears, you don't experience a lot of laughter. It just makes life real flatline.
I described to a friend of mine as like waking up in a manila folder and it's a cloudy day. Everything is boring, unmemorable, unspecial.
It changed me. It changed who I was. It changed the essence of my personality.
You know, it just started making me worse. And I got in such bad fights with my brother. I scratched his face up and, you know, stuff like that.
I started to experience suicidal ideations almost immediately. And I had never had any feeling like that before.
I remember when I was at home one day, I had taken my medication and I thought about killing myself, and I got really scared, so I ran to my brother and I told him, and he just held me and told me not to give up and to just keep trying.
And I actually thought that's maybe the one thing that I do have control over, that I could, you know, I could off myself, and I would be out of this roller coaster of an existence.
I have been raped. I have been coerced into doing things that I do not care to speak of. But just to put it in perspective, even having experienced that, the experiences in thoughts and loss of self that I had. Being put on Prozac was the worst violation I have ever experienced.
Mir fehlen die Worte. Die Leute wissen nicht, was diese Mittel anrichten, weil sie ihrem Psychiater vertrauen.
Nicht nur das. Studien haben gezeigt, dass ihre Mittel, wie zum Beispiel Antidepressiva, Störungen nicht besser heilen als eine Zuckerpille. Ein Placebo.
Um es zusammenzufassen. Mit dem DSM stempeln Psychiater ihre Patienten ab. Und es liefert die Rechtfertigung für den Einsatz von schweren Psychopharmaka, die viele Nebenwirkungen haben und nicht einmal funktionieren. Das ist wirklich verkorkst.
Eindeutig. Und sie klammern sich immer noch an die Idee, unerwünschtes Verhalten mit Chemikalien korrigieren zu können. Natürlich ist die Psychiatrie für die pharmazeutische Industrie attraktiv, da diese nun Psychopharmaka für jede Störung im DSM vermarkten kann.
Ich kenne diese Kampagnen, es gibt sie überall.
Ja, aber sie vermarkten ebenfalls die Störung. Pharmakonzerne werben für Störungen aus dem DSM in den Printmedien, im Fernsehen und im Internet und fordern die Leute auf, mit ihrem Arzt zu sprechen. Sie lassen ihre bezahlten Fachleute in Talkshows über die neueste Epidemie der Geisteskrankheit sprechen. Sie bringen Zeitungsartikel und stellen sogar Psychiater an, damit sie Abhandlungen schreiben, sodass die Störung ein wissenschaftliches Flair erhält.
Denn wenn die Leute denken, sie hätten die Störung, werden sie nach dem Mittel fragen.
Genau.
The pharmaceutical industry markets disorders. Because if you can market a disorder, then you've got something to sell your product to treat.
So people suddenly come to think of things they previously didn't regard as a disease state as a disease. Go to the doctor, see the psychiatrist. The psychiatrist then prescribes the drug that the drug companies have received FDA approval for. And everyone is happy except for the patient.
They're all working together, the psychiatrists, the pharmaceuticals, and one feeds the other. So again, job security for the pharmaceuticals and also job security for the psychiatrists.
Es sind nicht nur die Pharmafirmen, die diese Krankheiten verkaufen. Psychiater Josef Biedermann schuf die sogenannte bipolare Störung bei Kindern. Er behauptete, sie könne einsetzen, sobald das Kind zum ersten Mal die Augen öffnet.
Bipolar? Sowas wie Stimmungsschwankungen? Bei Kindern?
Leider ja. In nur 9 Jahren hat Dr. Biedermann einen Boom geschaffen, der die Anzahl der als bipolar bezeichneten Kinder vervierzigfachte. Den meisten wurden starke Neuroleptika verschrieben, die nur für schwer Geisteskranke gedacht sind.
Davon hatte ich keine Ahnung.
Der Psychiater, der das DSM-4 redigierte, gab zu, dass das DSM half, diesen Trend zu schaffen.
Well, we learned some very, very painful lessons in doing DSM-4, but inadvertently, I think we helped to trigger 3 false epidemics. One for the childhood diagnosis of bipolar disorder.
Jetzt ist es zu spät, oder?
Für viele Kinder schon, da Psychiater behaupten, dass psychische Störungen wie die bipolare Störung nicht geheilt werden können, haben Psychiater und Pharmafirmen lebenslängliche Kunden geschaffen.
Das ist eine natürliche Partnerschaft.
Klar, Pharmafirmen stellen Psychiater riesige Forschungsgelder zur Verfügung. Diese erfinden dann noch mehr Diagnosen, die mit Psychopharmaka zu behandeln sind.
Drug companies have become increasingly dependent on mental illness diagnoses in order to maintain their profit margins. And psychiatrists and increasingly clinical psychologists are more than happy to manufacture mental illness in order to make that happen. Hence, the increase in size of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders.
The strategy is how many people we can diagnose with a particular label that would be broad enough to include a ton of people in it. And the mentality behind that is the sale of the pharmaceutical drug, which eventually becomes the treatment.
These drug companies are making a lot of money, and they're spilling that money and sending that money to people that will help support their cause. So it's not a surprise at all that they have infiltrated so many of the committees within the DSM and so much of our own medical education.
Moment mal, die Pharmafirmen haben die Komitees von Psychiatern infiltriert, die entscheiden, welche Störung ins nächste DSM aufgenommen wird?
Beim DSM-4 hatten 56% der Komiteemitglieder persönliche finanzielle Verbindungen zu Pharmafirmen, denselben, die aus den 115 zusätzlichen psychischen Krankheiten Nutzen ziehen, die per Abstimmung aufgenommen wurden.
Daher gibt es mehr Diagnosen, die mit Psychopharmaka behandelt werden.
Und viel mehr Symptome, die für jede einzelne aufgeführt werden.
The whole world is being made crazy, really. And we have these proliferation of categories which have become more and more encompassing, encroaching in ordinary everyday life.
There isn't a human being on the planet who doesn't have at some point, if not several points, in a day or a week, distress. It's part of being human. But to say that because you have this distress, that you now are diseased.
If you take a god man in India who wanders around with a shawl and meditates for 17 hours a day, drinks rainwater and engages in some kind of spiritual or religious discipline or practice where he might roll on the ground for 100 miles to a holy place, people there don't persecute those individuals. They accept them as people engaged in religious practices. But here, if you took those same individuals in India and you had them walk across a campus in America, they would immediately be arrested and put into a psychiatric facility because they're manifesting psychosis. This varies by culture.
What do we want to straitjacket everybody? Is everyone going to be the same? What about people that do have a little bit odd behavior? Is a little odd behavior bad or dangerous? It's just different.
You want this thing to cover, all manner of aberrant human behavior. So if you can cover every bit of it, then you're going to have the best chance possible to a billable unit of service.
Und übrigens, falls Sie in keine Ihrer Kategorien passen, gibt es noch eine, die Sie Ihnen anhängen können.
Natürlich.
This is number 301.9.
312.9. 292.9.
Bipolar disorder, not otherwise specified.
Gender identity disorder, not otherwise specified.
Disorder of infancy, childhood, or adolescence, not otherwise specified.
Not otherwise specified.
What the hell does that say? They don't know.
It's kind of like a catch-all.
It's the garbage can for the leftovers.
There's even a box for people that don't fit in the other boxes.
To me, it's insane.
This is like rubbish to me.
This is scary to me. This is hackery, quackery, dockery.
Das ist eine ziemliche Pseudowissenschaft, wenn die Kategorien so unzulänglich sind, dass man Sonstiges benötigt.
Ja, wie nicht näher bezeichnete ADHS, nicht näher bezeichnete Essstörung, nicht näher bezeichnete affektive Störungen.
You can always use the NOS, the not otherwise specified diagnosis, and that's a billable service.
Not otherwise specified means that you're sort of at sea to some extent on the exact diagnosis, meaning it doesn't fit into any of the categories you've established.
Unspecified mental disorder. You see, that's considered a disorder. Having nothing wrong with you is now a disorder. That's what this says. Can you believe it?
Nein, ich kann das nicht glauben. Es gibt eine Kategorie unspezifische psychische Störung, nicht psychotisch. Das heißt, wir beschreiben das nicht. Das ist auch eine Geisteskrankheit?
Es wird noch verrückter. Gemäß DSM könnte auch eine psychische Störung diagnostiziert werden, die gar nicht aufgeführt wird.
Sie machen Witze.
Hören Sie sich das an.
These diagnostic criteria and the DSM-4 classification of mental disorders reflect a consensus of current formulations of evolving knowledge in our field. They do not encompass, however, all the conditions for which people may be treated or that may be appropriate topics for research efforts.
It's even in the language of the introduction, it's basically saying, we're trying to have a diagnosis to cover all the bases of anything that somebody could come in complaining about, which is, again, entirely backwards from how medical diagnoses are come to.
Dieses DSM kommt Medizin nicht einmal nahe, oder?
Nein, das ist einfach Marketing.
God bless the insurance companies.
when you get these multiple personalities, you can call insurance companies for it.
Insurance billing, that's the big money right there.
Das stört mich immer noch etwas. Wenn psychiatrische Behandlung so lange dauert, teuer und unwirksam ist.
Ich weiß. Wer wird freiwillig diese immensen Summen für psychiatrische Behandlungen ausgeben, die sich über Jahre hinzieht, manchmal sogar lebenslang, wenn sie so schlechte Ergebnisse hat?
Genau, wer zahlt das alles?
Vor allem die gesetzlichen und privaten Krankenkassen.
Na klar, Versicherungen.
Tatsächlich erwirkte die psychiatrische, pharmazeutische Lobby Gesetze, die Versicherungen zwingen, psychiatrische Behandlung im selben Maß zu übernehmen wie normale ärztliche Behandlung.
Das nennt man Gleichstellung psychiatrischer Behandlung, stimmt's?
Richtig, aber wirtschaftlich war das katastrophal.
So there's nobody who walks into a psychiatrist's office that isn't going to go out with a label. He's got 374 choices or so based on the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual list of symptoms. So he's got to fit you into one of those categories in order to get paid.
The DSM really should be called, how to bill the insurance companies, how to get money from the insurance companies. It's a list of codes, and there's a number for everything, and that number goes on an insurance form, and then you get payment for it.
The DSM is completely built into the system now because you can't get reimbursed by an insurance company unless there's a DSM diagnosis.
A kid wets the bed, you can bill on that. They're going to have one called a skin picking disorder. You pick your skin, you can diagnose and bill on that. You can always find a diagnosis and you'll always be able to bill.
A psychiatrist or psychologist can go through their book now and find a diagnosis code for just about anything. Everybody would fall into something that they could put a diagnosis on and fraud insurance companies.
Was für ein Schwindel!
Ganz genau. Jedes Jahr verwendet die psychiatrische Industrie das DSM, um $100 Milliarden von der US-Regierung und Privatversicherern einzustreichen. Das ist nur ein Land.
Jetzt verstehe ich, wie sehr das DSM die Kosten für medizinische Versorgung in die Höhe getrieben hat.
Ich weiß, die durchschnittliche Rechnung eines Psychiaters ist doppelt so hoch wie für allgemeine ärztliche Behandlung.
Und das erhöht dann meine Versicherungsbeiträge.
Genau, und Steuern werden auch verschwendet. Das Versicherungsprogramm für psychiatrische Behandlung in Texas ging fast bankrott, und zwar wegen sehr teurer Psychopharmaka, die normalerweise für bipolare Störung verschrieben werden.
Das sind eine Menge Psychopharmaka.
Auf jeden Fall. Da die DSM-Diagnosen derart willkürlich sind, kann außerdem Versicherungsbetrug ein weiteres, riesiges und teures Problem sein. Private psychiatrische Kliniken gaben sich als Kliniken zum Nikotinentzug oder zur Gewichtsabnahme aus, damit Leute sich meldeten.
Come with me.
Sie zahlten Anwerbern $3.000 pro Kopf, um Kassenpatienten hereinzubringen.
How many more you got coming? A bunch.
Und sie behielten Patienten so lange in Behandlung, bis ihr Versicherungsschutz auslief.
Es geht also alles nur um die Versicherungsgelder.
Genau. Sobald Patienten aufgenommen sind, kann jede Diagnose aus dem DSM verwendet werden, um eine Behandlung zu rechtfertigen. Schauen Sie sich diese verdeckten Aufnahmen von jemandem an, der vorgab, in einer Klinik tätig zu sein.
I'll say patient display. That's how my opening is always a classic. Patient display. He's sort of, what do you think? You think he's,
I thought, I've interacted with him a lot, and I thought he's always appropriate. He's always...
But under behavior, what's some good words in here? He's not negative. He's sort of intrusive a little bit.
He's not really.
He doesn't push limits anymore.
He's really acting intrusive.
He acts sort of anxious. Focus on the negative.
And why should we focus on the negative?
Because that's how they get paid. This is what they told me. You write what you want to write. I know I got to write for it. So I know what I have to write. You know what I mean? So that's why
Like, why do you have to write it?
So this place can get paid. It's a business thing. It's not like I'm lying, but I always pull the negative out. Like,
you're supposed to. They tell you to.
What? The negative?
Pull the negative out.
You pull it out of them.
Das kann nicht ethisch sein.
Ist es nicht. Und das ist nur der Anfang des Betrugs. Mitarbeiter des psychiatrischen Systems stellten Versicherungen in Rechnung, dass ihre Patienten Musik hörten, Fernsahen oder Bingo spielten. Sie berechneten Wegrufe, Theaterkarten oder Überseereisen oder die angebliche Behandlung von Leuten, die im Gefängnis saßen, im Koma lagen oder tot waren.
Nein.
Einige Psychiater flogen sogar auf, weil sie Sex mit ihren Patienten als Therapie in Rechnung stellten.
Das ist abscheulich.
Ein Experte für Versicherungsbetrug drückt es so aus: Dem Ausmaß des Betruges wird nur durch die Fantasiegrenzen gesetzt.
Davon hatte ich keine Ahnung.
Das trifft auf viele Leute zu. Betrug im psychiatrischen System kostet Versicherungen und Steuerzahler allein in den USA 5 Milliarden Dollar pro Jahr.
Man sollte diese Verbrecher einsperren und den Schlüssel wegwerfen.
It's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, the 3rd edition.
Erwähnte ich, dass die Psychiatrie das DSM auch sehr erfolgreich einsetzt, um unser Gerichtssystem zu infiltrieren?
Auch die Gerichte?
Ja.
The clinical diagnosis of a DSM-4 mental disorder is not sufficient to establish the existence for legal purposes of a mental disorder. That's a very interesting point. Basically, what the authors are saying here is that the material in the DSM has no utility in the courtroom in deciding guilt or innocence. It should not be used in courtrooms as part of the legal process.
Moment mal, hieß es nicht gerade im DSM, dass es nicht verwendet werden kann, um das Vorhandensein einer psychischen Störung vor Gericht zu bestimmen?
Ganz genau. Und trotzdem passiert das ständig.
Wie wenn auf Unzurechnungsfähigkeit plädiert wird.
More specifically, not guilty by reason of insanity.
Wie steht es um Sorgerecht, Einweisungen, Nachlassgerichte?
That she doesn't currently suffer from any type of mental illness that would make her a danger.
Ich habe gelesen, dass Psychiater auf entgegengesetzten Seiten vor Gericht stehen und mit dem DSM ihre Argumente untermauerten, und dennoch werden beide vor Gericht als Sachverständige akzeptiert.
There was no evidence, as far as I could see, for psychosis or delusions.
Because he's suffering from narcissistic personality disorder and a delusional disorder.
Das widerspricht sich völlig. Es war nicht immer so.
In the beginning of the 20th century, a psychiatrist in a courtroom would be laughed out of the courtroom by and large. Today, it's commonly accepted testimony as long as it's in accord with the DSM.
The danger in using the DSM in a court setting is that you're using a vocabulary that the judge or the jury doesn't fully understand. They are, by concocting these psychobabble words, it makes it seem like there's something there that may not be there.
The courts have allowed all this junk science to come into the courts, and they've made case law on it. And once the case law is made, we're stuck with it until it gets overridden.
They come in with tests, they come in with their diagnostic categories from the DSM, and they say, we've done tests, we've determined that this person has this numbered malady, and therefore they do. And there's almost no way to pry a judge out of accepting that.
When a psychiatrist makes a diagnosis in court, is that the person is sent to a mental institution, deprived of liberty, and we have no idea whether he's guilty or not.
Auf der Grundlage des DSM wird alle 40 Sekunden jemand irgendwo in eine psychiatrische Anstalt zwangseingewiesen.
Das ist so ein Unrecht.
Und jedermann kann zu jeder Zeit alles verlieren. Nur aufgrund der Meinung eines Psychiaters. Hören Sie sich das an.
I went to a stop smoking course at Vanderbilt. And the doctor, the lady that ran the program said that she goes, we need to get you on a stop smoking medication. So she prescribed me Zyban. Well, after the fact, I find out that Zyban is nothing but this really powerful antidepressant called Wellbutrin. Yeah, I stopped smoking, but I had no idea the hell. I mean, the hell. The hell's gates were being opened when I started taking Zyban. I had been clean and sober for 18 years. Just never considered that. But something about that, I started experiencing the craving to drink again, and my life fell apart. Divorce, relapse. So then a sibling of mine got wind of my relapse, wanted to gain control of my pocketbook and my life, and found the dirtiest lawyer in town who knew, one of the dirty psychiatrists, and bought and paid for an evaluation, had a hearing in a court before I was ever served notice. And the next thing I know, every right that a human being can possibly have was taken from me. And you have less rights as a conserved person than you do as a criminal. I mean, you are stripped of every right. You can't enter into a contract. You cannot marry. You cannot sue. You cannot even fight the legal system that has involuntarily put you in this. And it was all based on the psychiatrist's diagnosis, who never evaluated me.
Das ist unglaublich. Er wollte bloß mit dem Rauchen aufhören, aber erhielt eine psychiatrische Diagnose und wurde seiner Rechte beraubt.
Sein ganzes Geld war weg und er wurde in eine Anstalt gesteckt. Falls Sie meinen, es wäre schlimm, was Psychiater Leuten im Gerichtssaal antun, schauen Sie nur, was mit Familien passiert.
Children are taken away from parents every day in these juvenile courts because a person with a PhD or an MD after their name comes in and says, I've shown ink blots to a person, and they may be a risk to a child. Just in my little state of Massachusetts here, there are 11,000 children in captivity, taken away from families at any one moment. And almost all of those children are being drugged. And our own commissioner of children and families testified under oath that they drug 88% of the children that they take out of the families.
88% werden Psychopharmaka verabreicht? Das sind beinahe alle.
Und das ist nur die Spitze des Eisbergs. In aller Welt setzen Psychiater das Gerichtssystem ein, um Menschen ihrer Rechte zu berauben und Familien zu zerstören. Schauen Sie sich das an.
Psychiatry has affected my family through the family law court rulings. The family law court has a court-appointed child psychiatrist who, it appears, determines the future of the child.
It's just like a business in the court system that they forced you to undergo all of these psychological evaluations, and you have to pay thousands of dollars, but at the end of the day, it has been supported by no evidence, nothing.
They said to me, Deb, you have a choice. Either you bring your son to get medicated, or we'll take your child away from you and put him in a home that they'll medicate your child. And then good luck. Basically, they were saying, good luck, Deb, to try and get your son back, but you'll get him back medicated anyways.
And they put her in hospital, and that's when the psychotropic drugging started with Becky. And at that stage, I had no say over it.
They refused to let her go. They would not let my daughter go unless she take medication.
This was again a recommendation from the psychiatrist that once my son was radically ripped from his home and literally kidnapped and put in a new home with a perpetrator of domestic violence and of sexual assault, and is where he now lives, this psychiatrist said that he was never to have any counselling and never to see anybody.
To have your family just disrupted like that, ripped out from under you, really, your whole life, just gone like that, and then you have to fight every day to get him back. It was very devastating.
In some ways, it's worse than a death because it's unresolved, and you know what the truth is. And you feel like giving up and not fighting back for that custody of that child, but you can't. There's just no justice.
Das ist furchtbar. Sie reißen Familien aufgrund willkürlicher Diagnosen auseinander, die im Gerichtswesen zirkulieren?
Genau.
So it's unfortunate that the courts have bought into the DSM. It's unfortunate that the whole psychiatric profession is wedded to the DSM. It's unfortunate that the psychiatric profession is in bed with the drug industry, and it's unfortunate that drugs that don't work are the common prescribed drugs for all manner of conditions in children and in adults. It's the wrong way to go.
Oh nein, nicht auch die Kinder.
Leider ja. Kinder sind jetzt ein riesiges Marktsegment für die Psychiatrie. Die Anzahl der im DSM aufgeführten Störungen im Kindes- und Jugendalter stieg von 3 Störungen im Jahre 1952 auf gegenwärtig 44 an.
Das sind 15 Mal so viele.
Dabei wird im DSM zugegeben, dass bei Kindern keine Diagnose erstellt werden sollte.
In early childhood, it may be difficult to distinguish symptoms of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder from age-appropriate behaviors in active children, such as running around or being noisy. We basically don't know the diagnosis from normal childhood. That's what that's saying.
Aufmerksamkeitsdefizit-Hyperaktivitätsstörung. Damit bezeichnen Psychiater Kinder, die in der Schule nicht stillsitzen, zappeln, herumlaufen oder klettern. Normales Kinderverhalten, stimmt's?
Genau. 20 Millionen Kindern in aller Welt wurde irgendeine psychische Störung angehängt.
Anstatt Kinder Kinder sein zu lassen,
sagen Psychiater den Eltern, dass ihre Kinder psychisch krank sind und Psychopharmaka brauchen.
It used to be that you were on the playground, you'd had the weird kid, you had the shy kid, you had the goof off, you had the hyper kid. You can't have that anymore. Now it's all medical diagnoses.
For them to come up with new diseases and new issues and diagnosis in their book, it doesn't correct bad behavior, okay? They can give children all the pills they want. It still doesn't correct bad behavior.
The thinking still is, you must fit into this mold. And if you don't fit into this mold, there's something wrong with you. And if you're not the person who designs the mold, too bad for you.
A child is labeled and then they're brought to professionals who are trained a very particular way. They're all being trained that if the child fits into this category, then we should consider putting them on Ritalin because that's what they do. That is the protocol.
The way the Ritalin will be marketed to the parents is that they will say, this is a drug to calm your child down. What they won't say is that methylphenidate is a form of speed. It's a form of amphetamine, and what we're actually doing is overdosing your child on speed.
It's a stimulant, so naturally it's going to increase heart rate, increase blood pressure, and you put a kid out on a football field on a hot summer day, and his risk of having a cardiac event of some sort has just gone up.
Ich hörte, dass Stimulantien, die Kindern wegen Aufmerksamkeitsproblemen verabreicht werden, chemisch Kokain sehr ähnlich sind.
Ja, und sie haben ein derart hohes Missbrauchspotenzial, dass die US-Regierung sie in dieselbe Kategorie wie Morphium, Opium und Methamphetamin eingestuft hat.
Wen werden Psychiater als nächstes auf Psychopharmaka setzen? Babys?
Genau. Sie verwenden dafür die diagnostische Klassifikation 0 bis 3 oder DC 0 bis 3. Das ist wie ein Mini-DSM für Babys und Kleinkinder. Hören Sie sich das an.
We already targeted our school children with ADHD and bipolar. That's already done. That was done 20 years ago. And we're moving younger with DCO3 to the 0 to 3 age group where they're trying to make popular the idea that it's okay to medicate 0 to 3-year-olds.
The idea of a program to determine whether a child from birth to the age of 3 has a mental illness is so preposterous, so absolutely insane, that it's simply an additional part of the insanity that is now extant throughout this country. I cannot think of a program that is more insane than that.
How are they going to diagnose a 1-year-old or an infant with a psychological disorder? How do they know?
You almost have to ask ourselves, if our societies become sick, what are we doing to our fetuses, our infants, our children, that would make us need to have psychiatric medications?
We're rolling dice with life. We're rolling dice with our children who can't even discuss it with anybody. They have no control. They are the helpless victims, and the ones who are supposed to protect them and care aren't armed with the facts.
Eltern wären außer sich, wenn sie das wüssten.
Allerdings, doch Vorsicht, im DSM steht auch, dass sie sich bei ihren Kindern mit einer psychiatrischen Krankheit anstecken können.
Das kann doch nicht Ihr Ernst sein.
So steht es im DSM.
Oh.
We're going to talk about some of the proposed changes that are suggested for DSM-5.
Ich habe gehört, dass DSM-5 ist sogar noch verrückter als DSM-4.
Allerdings.
You've got 374 named diagnoses in DSM. Well, guess what? There's going to be more in DSM-5.
Why do we all of a sudden need a fifth, a DSM-5? Psychiatry wanted to broaden the horizons of mental health problems, of disorders. They wanted to stretch the disorders so it would encompass more. And to do that, they're going to add more diagnoses.
We need more diagnoses like we need a hole in the head, really. They're not serving a purpose for mankind, all these diagnoses. They're almost laughable, some of the diagnoses.
Lachhaft? Wirklich?
Nun, Sie sprechen von einer Anhäufungsstörung, wenn man nicht genügend Dinge wegwirft.
Persistent difficulty discarding or parting with personal possessions.
Heißhungerstörung, wenn man sich zu oft überisst.
Recurrent episodes of binge eating.
Oh, und da ist noch die Dermatillomanie.
So it's recurrent skin picking resulting in skin.
Diese Dinge sind psychische Störungen?
Für Kinder gibt es eine neue Störung, die die große Anzahl von Kindern umfassen wird, deren Wutanfälle noch nicht bipolar genannt werden können.
They've created temper dysregulation disorder to seem a little bit more mild of the condition and include a lot of the younger population in terms of that diagnosis. And what it essentially does, it just broadens bipolar disorder into a whole other new category. And where they don't fit into bipolar, now they can fit into this other diagnosing criteria.
Das Netz wird immer größer.
Größer als Sie denken. Sie wollen sogar eine Bezeichnung dafür schaffen, dass man zu viel vor dem Computer sitzt.
Internet addiction diagnosis. It's another example of, just taking something going on in the popular culture that's, pretty widespread and then finding a way to pathologize it.
I know people personally that spend 12, 13, 14 hours a day on the internet or social networking groups like Facebook. So there is something going on there. But is it a condition that we need to then label and drug? Absolutely not.
Das ist lachhaft.
Ja, bis man bedenkt, dass die Regierung von China bereits psychiatrische Kliniken eingerichtet hat, die Teenager wegen problematischen Computergebrauchs behandeln und manchmal Elektroschocks zur Heilung einsetzen.
Nein.
Wenn Sie denken, das wäre schlimm, es gibt einen weiteren Zusatz im nächsten DSM, der wirklich erschreckend ist.
Noch schlimmer?
Damit erweitern Sie die Diagnose psychischer Störungen um einiges. Das Risiko einer Psychose-Syndrom, das kürzlich unter dem geschwollenen Namen abgeschwächtes psychotisches Syndrom bekannt wurde.
Was für ein Zungenbrecher. Was heißt das?
A really scary thing that's coming on the horizon is to come up with a whole bunch of diagnoses in there that are looking at people who currently are mentally well-adjusted but have a risk of developing a mental illness in the future.
They're still thinking they can define well before the symptoms develop the risk of a person developing a major mental disorder without any biochemical, biological or genetic test or any physical test whatsoever.
They don't know the cause of a mental illness. They can't treat it, they can't cure it. So how can they launch a preventative campaign for mental illness? It just logically, it falters.
Moment mal. Denken die Psychiater wirklich, sie können eine Störung in der Zukunft vorhersagen?
Hören wir, was Sie sagen.
How can psychiatrists know if you're going to have a mental disorder in the future?
Again, that we don't know categorically who will develop psychiatric illness in the future.
It's really hard to say, actually. I don't know if you could 100% predict for anybody.
You can't forecast if one will develop a psychiatric disorder.
Maybe not, or maybe yes.
It's hard to predict.
It's hard to predict.
There's no way to predict that.
Well, I don't think that nobody knows that.
There's no way to tell.
Nobody knows?
I don't think anyone can know what's going to happen in the future.
Die haben offensichtlich keine Ahnung.
Ja, aber trotzdem planen sie bereits, Kinder auf künftige psychische Störungen hin zu untersuchen.
Um sie jetzt zu behandeln.
Ganz genau.
I would hate to see us go into the type of society where people are locked up for what they may do in the future, rather than what they actually have done.
Identifying people who are pre-psychotic would be a huge industry.
Wow, das ist wirklich erschreckend.
Das Verrückte ist, dass Psychiater weiterhin am DSM-5 arbeiten, obwohl einige der Einflussreichsten offen zugeben, dass es völlig wertlos ist.
Any comment on DSM-5? It's of no use to us in the rest of the world. You know?
Selbst der für das US National Institute of Mental Health verantwortliche Psychiater ist wenig begeistert davon.
I don't do DSM. I'm not involved. So, and that maybe tells you more than anything. NIMH is not involved with DSM-5.
Der Mann an der Spitze der größten psychiatrischen Regierungsbehörde der Welt möchte nichts mit dem DSM zu tun haben?
So sieht es aus. Es ist ein völliger Betrug.
The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual is effectively the story that is being wrapped up in statistics and numbers and categories that when medicine tosses, doesn't fit any of our categories over to psychiatry, psychiatry says we'll find a category, and if we don't, DSM-5 or 6 or 7 will.
I think in 2016 we'll be looking at DSM-6 and there will be 1,425 diagnoses and I'll have 900 of them.
Das ist verrückt.
Ja, alles zielt darauf ab, immer mehr Leute in eine psychiatrische Diagnose zu zwingen.
Damit sie noch mehr Geld mit normalem menschlichen Verhalten scheffeln können.
Ganz genau.
Wenn das DSM so komplett unnütz ist, warum machen die Psychiater... Oh, verstehe. Es geht ums Geld, nicht wahr?
Bei der Psychiatrie geht es immer nur ums Geld. Und es fängt alles mit dem DSM an, wie Robert Spitzer sagte.
The American Psychiatric Association found out it could make a lot of money by selling it. They've made a tremendous amount of money.
Every time they revise the DSM system, the American Psychiatric Association makes a hell of a lot of money.
Ein Haufen Geld? Wie viel denn?
6,5 Millionen Dollar in Verkäufen pro Jahr.
Puh.
Aber der Profit kommt nicht nur vom Verkauf des DSM. Psychiater und Pharmafirmen machen jedes Mal Geld, wenn sie mit dem DSM jemanden diagnostizieren.
You create disorders so that you can treat it with a drug. It's the ultimate money-making machine.
How many people can we drug? How many labels can we put out there? How many people can we herd into these labels and feed them a drug so we can get richer, make more money?
There's an inherent conflict of interest, and that conflict of interest is driven by the desire to make money. More money, more money, more money than one should expect.
Huge money in the psychopharm business. If you really did the research on these diagnoses, see that 90% of them or more don't exist, they're not valid, then that's all of a sudden, all that reimbursement from the insurance companies disappears.
So we have to cut the money cord, as well as cutting the DSM cord if we're ever going to really succeed stopping this juggernaut from continuing.
Once again, it's follow the money. And you'll get your answer every time.
Dies hat mir die Augen geöffnet. Schauen wir mal. Es gibt keine Labortests für eine sogenannte psychische Störung, die Psychiater nicht einmal in ihrem eigenen Handbuch beschreiben können. Die Theorie des chemischen Ungleichgewichts ist völlig unhaltbar. Trotzdem wird behauptet, man könne die Hirnchemie mit Psychopharmaka ausgleichen und sie werden allen Altersgruppen verschrieben.
Ja, für 84 Milliarden Dollar pro Jahr. Das heißt, allein in den USA sind das 10 Milliarden Dollar mehr an Versicherungsprämien.
Und wir bezahlen das mit mehr Steuern und Krankenkassenzahlungen.
Genau. Die gesamte psychiatrische Industrie verwendet das DSM, um 330 Milliarden Dollar pro Jahr einzustreichen.
Das sind $1/3 Billion.
Und es steigt noch. Es ist außer Kontrolle.
Well, the whole system is now a runaway train, but the DSM is the locomotive. And if you took the locomotive off, eventually the train would stop, because there'd be nothing more pulling it.
We're losing the concept of health. Everybody is sick and everybody's got a condition and everybody needs drugs.
You're going to end up with a whole society that's going to basically have to be led around by the hand. But who's going to lead them around? Because they're drugging so many of them.
In psychiatry, you know in your heart of hearts that you're not really diagnosing. You know in your heart of hearts that you can't really treat what you think might be wrong. And you also know that most of what you're dealing with in the DSM is unprovable and unreliable, not a predictable indicator. So what do you have then?
Gute Frage. Sie haben wohl gar nichts.
Und Menschen wird Schaden zugefügt.
Ja.
You're very lucky to go through psychiatry and survive. It really is as simple as that.
Only when enough people rip the veneer away and show that it's just nothing more than a Hollywood set is it ever going to fall down.
It would be good if all the medical professionals who are really practicing medicine and really trying to help people and based on scientific fact and what they can best do to improve the lives of others, if they would recognize, just be able to look at this fact. It's hard to look at it, but look at this fact and be ethical and be honest and clean up the profession by getting rid of this fraudulent part of it. Psychiatry.
Ich hätte es nicht besser sagen können. Es ist so offensichtlich. Wir müssen das DSM loswerden. Es ist schrecklich für die Gesellschaft.
Ich weiß. Trotz der äußerst wackeligen Grundlage hat sich das Diagnosehandbuch der Psychiatrie auf jeden Teil unseres Lebens ausgewirkt.
Unsere Schulen und Regierungen.
Unsere Gerichtshöfe.
Und die Medien und das Militär?
Die auch.
Praktisch die ganze Gesellschaft.
Und das ohne eine einzige Person zu heilen.
Das DSM ist mehr als nur ein Kartenhaus.
Das diagnostische und statistische Manual ist das tödliche Blendwerk der Psychiatrie.